She didn't scream when her husband took a mistress. She didn't need to. What unfolded afterward was quieter than betrayal, yet far more destructive. A home shifted. Loyalties bent. And a woman who seemed powerless began turning the entire household without raising her voice. The mistress never understood when the walls stopped belonging to her. The husband realized too late that influence could vanish in silence. Tonight, you will walk through this Tudor home and feel how power changes without a single sound. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into the private chambers of a Tudor household, the first thing noticed would not be affection, but arrangement. Everything in the room would tell a story of duty rather than desire. The placement of the marriage bed, the locked chests holding property lists, and the papers recording alliances between families. Marriage in this world was less a bond of emotion and more a framework for managing land, lineage, and reputation. The silence in these rooms often felt rehearsed, as though each member of the household had learned their roles long before the ceremony ever took place. The husband stood at the center of this structure. His authority extended beyond the walls of the home, reaching into law, property, and public life. He held the legal right to own land, sign contracts, and make decisions that shaped the family's future. Inside the household, his voice carried weight even when he barely spoke. It was understood, and the understanding itself was a form of power. No one questioned why his word mattered. It simply did. Because the world outside reinforced it daily. The wife, however, occupied a different kind of space. Visible, necessary, but constrained. Her presence legitimized the family's name and secured alliances with other households. She was the face of order, the one expected to uphold moral appearance, manage the daily rhythm, and maintain the sense of dignity that others would judge. Yet she did all this without legal control over the very property she helped protect. Her influence lived in routines, the way meals were served, how servants behaved, and how visitors perceived the household's stability. These subtleties did not erase her lack of formal authority, but they shaped how smoothly the home functioned. Behind the doors, an unspoken calculation guided every interaction. A Tudor marriage was a negotiation between the visible and the hidden, between authority and obligation. Husbands navigated public expectations, wives navigated domestic survival. Each role depended on the other, yet neither was equal. When shifts occurred, when a mistress appeared, when rumors spread, when servants whispered, these cracks revealed how fragile the balance truly was. The wife's position, though lacking legal strength, anchored the household's legitimacy. Without her, alliances weakened, reputations trembled, and inheritance lines blurred. She was the stabilizing force, often overlooked, expected to uphold a structure she did not design. There was an irony in this. The household could not stand without her. Yet she did not control its foundations. Her power lived in perception, not in law, and that made it both subtle and deeply vulnerable. Servants observed this dynamic with quiet familiarity. They knew which footsteps belonged to authority and which ones carried restraint. They saw the distance between husband and wife at the dinner table, the careful politeness exchanged in hallways, the silence that filled their shared spaces. To them, marriage appeared less as companionship and more as performance, each person aware of their role, aware of what breaking character might cost. Visitors saw something different. They saw a respectable family presenting itself according to expectation. They admired the order of the home, the discipline of routines, and the polite distance interpreted as dignity. What they did not see was the shifting tensions beneath the surface, especially when a new presence disrupted the fragile balance. A mistress entering this world did not merely disrupt affection, she disrupted structure. She targeted the one place where the wife held her quiet influence, the inner life of the household. But before any conflict unfolded, before whispers spread or loyalties shifted, the foundation remained unmistakably clear. The husband possessed tangible authority, the wife possessed symbolic necessity. These two forms of power shaped the home differently, yet both were required to keep it standing. The imbalance was woven into the very fabric of Tudor society, accepted as naturally as the weather. A Tudor marriage, therefore, was not a story of love tested by betrayal. It was a story of structure challenged by intrusion. When a mistress appeared, she stepped into a system already heavy with expectations. Her presence exposed not only emotional strain, but the fundamental asymmetry built into the marriage itself. The wife faced the burden of maintaining legitimacy even as it was threatened, while the husband exercised authority even when his choices endangered the stability he depended on. Within these unsteady dynamics, power did not move loudly. It shifted through small gestures, controlled reactions, and deliberate silence. The household reflected these shifts without announcing them. The wife learned to read every change, a missing purse of coins, a servant's altered tone, the husband's absence at certain hours. She understood that authority could be weakened from within long before it fell apart from outside. This awareness shaped her responses, quiet but strategic. In such a world, the question of who held power was more complicated than the laws suggested. The husband controlled the framework. The wife controlled how the framework functioned each day. One held authority that could be declared, the other held influence that could be withdrawn. The imbalance between the two created a tension that grew sharper whenever external forces, especially a mistress, entered the home. And in that tension, the wife discovered the edges of her own power, limited, yet far from meaningless. The truth of Tudor marriage was simple but unsettling. It was a structure built on defined roles, but sustained by unspoken negotiations. Husbands spoke for the household, wives held it together. Authority and necessity lived side by side, never fully aligned, always sensitive to disruption. And when disruption came, the wife often understood it first, not because she was weak, but because she was the one expected to keep everything from collapsing. The household's stability rested on appearances, but appearances rarely told the full story. Even in a home that seemed orderly, the smallest fracture could reveal how uneven the foundations truly were. And once that fracture appeared, nothing inside the walls would remain untouched. The balance within this marriage held for now, shaped by duty and silence. A quiet shift was already gathering beneath the routines of daily life. Somewhere inside this domestic calm, a presence waited to disturb what seemed immovable. She entered the household without ceremony, without title, and without the expectations placed on the wife. Yet her presence immediately altered the atmosphere of every room she stepped into. The servants noticed it first, in the way conversations shifted when she appeared, or in the uneasy glances exchanged when her footsteps sounded down the corridor. A mistress did not hold legal standing, but she held something far more volatile: emotional influence. Her connection to the husband existed outside the structure of the household, and that alone made her a quiet disturbance. Her presence unsettled routines that had been steady for years. Meals were delayed, messages delivered differently, and decisions once discussed openly began drifting behind closed doors. The husband moved with a different rhythm around her, not always openly affectionate, but changed in a way that reached beyond words. This shift did not need to be announced. The household felt it long before anyone dared to speak of it. In a world where stability depended on predictable behaviors, even the smallest deviation carried weight. The wife understood what this change meant. even if no one explained it to her. She saw how servants adjusted their expressions when the mistress passed by, how the husband's voice lowered in tone, how the fragile balance she maintained now wavered. The mistress did not challenge her directly. Instead, she occupied the spaces between certainty and suspicion, turning the everyday into something unstable. The threat she represented came not from any declared intention, but from the way she altered how the husband saw himself and the household. Emotional influence often moved silently. The mistress could offer praise where the wife offered caution, laughter where the wife offered management, and flattery where the wife offered duty. These gestures, though small, shaped the husband's choices. Decisions, once grounded in household logic, leaned toward personal desire. Time once allocated to estate matters drifted toward private meetings. The mistress's power was not formal, yet it redirected the husband's attention. And attention was its own kind of authority. Her impact was most dangerous because it was difficult to confront. She had no official position to criticize, no responsibilities to fail, no duties that could be used against her. She lived on the edges of propriety, where rules were less clear and consequences less immediate. The wife, bound by decorum, could not accuse her outright without risking her own dignity. The husband, flattered by this newfound devotion, often dismissed any concerns. This left the mistress in a uniquely protected position, unofficial, yet shielded by emotion. Servants lived closest to this tension. They knew how influence travelled through glances, pause, and whispered requests. They noticed when gifts appeared unexpectedly, when the husband lingered too long in certain rooms, and when the mistress made small choices that shaped the household's rhythm. Their loyalty could shift, not out of defiance, but out of practicality. A mistress who gained the husband's favour often sought to reshape the household hierarchy in her image, rewarding obedience and punishing hesitation. The social world outside the home saw the situation differently. In public, the mistress was not acknowledged. She walked behind the household's reputation, never beside it. Yet everyone knew she existed. Neighbours speculated, acquaintances whispered, and local gossip filled the spaces where no official record could. Her role was undefined, but her presence was undeniable. Society pretended not to see her while watching her closely, a contradiction that left her suspended between acceptance and contempt. Inside the household, however, her influence was tangible. She could encourage the husband toward decisions that benefited her, narrowing his world until the wife's authority seemed remote and burdensome. This was not always deliberate. Sometimes it happened through simple needs. A request here, a comment there, that accumulated until the husband's priorities tilted. Emotional persuasion often felt harmless when it began, which made its consequences harder to recognize. The wife faced a quiet dilemma: act too strongly and risk appearing jealous or irrational. Act too gently and risk losing what little control she still held. Her position required balance, grace, and constant observation. The mistress, by contrast, operated without such constraints. She could express emotion freely, take risks without accountability, and occupy the emotional space the husband found most comforting. In this difference lies the true danger. The relationship between husband and mistress also shaped the social perception of the household. Even if unspoken, the mistress's presence suggested instability. It signaled weakness in the husband's discipline and cracks in the household's unity. Friends became cautious, relatives wary, business partners reconsidered alliances. The mistress, though unofficial, influenced how the entire family was seen, often in ways the husband refused to acknowledge. Yet the mistress herself was also vulnerable. Her power depended entirely on the husband's desire, which could shift without warning. She lived without the protection of marriage, lineage, or legal standing. A wife might lose influence, but a mistress could lose everything in an instant. This instability made her position both dangerous and fragile, capable of shaping the household while always at risk of being cast out. Still, in the moment when she held the husband's attention, she held a form of power unmatched by any written law. She could cloud his judgment, redirect his loyalties, and weaken his bond with his wife. The danger lay not in her status, but in how easily emotions distorted the foundations on which the household relied. A mistress did not need authority to disrupt, she needed only access. Her presence reminded everyone of how thin the line was between stability and disorder. A household built on duty could falter under the weight of desire. A marriage built on structure could strain under the influence of someone who existed outside those rules. And a wife who upheld the household's dignity could find herself struggling against challenges that left no trace except in the shifting behavior of the people around her. Her arrival changed nothing visibly, yet everything began to feel different. What once seemed predictable started to lose its certainty one small moment at a time. And in the quiet spaces of the home, the first signs of fracture waited for someone to notice. The shift in the household did not begin with raised voices or visible confrontation. It began with quiet intention, shaped by a wife who understood that subtle actions often carried more weight than declarations. She did not move against the mistress or the husband directly. Instead, she observed the rhythm of the home, the habits that had changed, and the loyalties that had begun to drift. She recognized that her strength did not lie in the authority she lacked, but in the spaces where influence could grow without being noticed. Her first step was directed at the mistress. Though no one could point to a single moment when it began, she adjusted routines, altered access to certain rooms, and made small decisions that reshaped the environment around the mistress. Invitations to shared meals grew spaced apart. Conversations among servants gradually excluded her, and tasks that once allowed the mistress to linger near the husband shifted quietly into other hands. Nothing appeared confrontational, yet each change nudged the mistress toward isolation. The household itself became a landscape she no longer moved through easily. These adjustments worked because they seemed natural. A change in seating, an unexpected visitor, a sudden need for privacy. Each event felt ordinary on its own, but over time, the mistress felt the weight of distance. Servants hesitated before addressing her, unsure of how openly they should engage. The wife did not need to speak her intentions aloud. The household learned them through silence. The mistress, once a presence that unsettled routines, now found routines closing around her. The husband noticed these changes, though at first he did not understand them. His moments with the mistress were interrupted by small demands that required his attention. A missing document, a message to be approved, a financial matter needing his signature. The wife brought these concerns forward calmly, without accusation, as though fulfilling her expected role. The timing, however, was precise. She understood his habits, his work, and the obligations he could not ignore. Each interruption placed a quiet barrier between him and the mistress, one he could not object to without seeming irresponsible. This was the essence of the wife's first step. Remove the mistress's footing, not through rejection, but through irrelevance. A woman who could not influence daily life, who could not move freely through the household, who could not claim space beside the husband, gradually lost the significance she once held. What had begun as emotional leverage now weakened, not by direct challenge, but by the disappearance of opportunities. The second step unfolded with equal subtlety. The wife turned her attention toward the husband, not with defiance, but with a strategic awareness of what bound him to the household. She did not argue his choices or criticize his behavior. Instead, she reminded him, indirectly, of the responsibilities that defined his position. She brought him matters of inheritance, disputes among tenants, and concerns about the estate's finances. Each issue required his judgment. Each problem reconnected him to the structure he had begun to drift from. The household grew heavier on his shoulders. Decisions piled up. Expectations resurfaced. He felt the strain of authority he had once taken for granted. And this made the sanctuary he found with the mistress feel less steady. Emotional indulgence could not withstand the weight of practical necessity. A man who believed he controlled everything now sensed the ground shifting beneath him. The wife did not push him away from the mistress. She allowed his own obligations to pull him back. She offered reminders of what only he could resolve, of tasks that required his presence, of documents no one else could sign. These responsibilities, once ignored, now demand attention. In the silence between these duties, he found less room for distraction. His weakening was not the result of humiliation or conflict. It arose from the slow realization that his influence depended on the household's stability, a stability he had neglected. The wife understood this long before he did. She guided him back into the structure where his authority was both recognized and constrained. She made the household unavoidable. Meanwhile, the servants responded to these shifts. They saw the wife's increasing involvement, her steady presence in matters of order and routine. They adjusted their loyalties accordingly, not out of affection, but out of a practical understanding that the wife remained the anchor of the home. The husband, despite his formal authority, now appeared less certain, less commanding. His reliance on his wife became more visible. This gradual repositioning weakened the husband's control without challenging it openly. It reminded him of his responsibilities while exposing how easily he could lose the coherence of his household. The mistress, once a source of emotional escape, now became a symbol of disorder, a reminder of choices he could not justify in the face of growing pressure. Through these two steps, the wife altered the entire household without raising her voice or making accusations. Her strategy was not reactive. It was deliberate. She moved within the rules that bound her, using limitations as tools rather than obstacles. She allowed silence to work in her favor, shaping outcomes without demanding acknowledgement. The household had shifted toward her even without a single confrontation. Influence settled quietly into the spaces where authority had once stood alone. What was beginning to surface inside these walls would not remain hidden for long. Silence inside a Tudor household carried a weight that few recognized until it settled fully into the rooms. When a wife chose not to argue, not to plead, and not to raise her voice, the absence of sound changed the way everyone moved around her. Servants stepped more carefully, watching her posture, her eyes, the way she placed a cup on the table or folded a piece of linen. Nothing about her behavior appeared dramatic. Yet the stillness around her suggested intention rather than defeat. In a home where authority was rarely questioned, silence became a signal that something had begun to shift. The husband often misunderstood this quiet. He believed the lack of protest meant acceptance, assuming the household had returned to calm. He moved through the rooms as if nothing had changed, unaware that his actions were now being measured, not counted. What he failed to see was that the wife's silence was not submission. It was calculation. She understood that words could be dismissed, but silence forced others to confront their own discomfort. Her restraint created space for people to see what they had ignored before, and this alone unsettled the balance he relied upon. In daily routines, her quiet presence became a constant reminder that something was out of place. She completed her tasks without hesitation, greeted visitors with composure, and guided the servants with a firmness that lacked emotion. Her steadiness contrasted sharply with the husband's growing unease, a difference the household could not overlook. Silence sharpened perception. It made every small detail stand out: the misplaced glance, the hurried footsteps, the forced laughter between the husband and the mistress. These things, once hidden by noise and distraction, now appeared starkly visible. The mistress found herself struggling most with this new quiet. The wife did not confront her, did not accuse her, did not engage her. Instead, she withdrew her reactions entirely, leaving the mistress without a clear sense of her standing. The uncertainty was more unnerving than open hostility. The mistress had expected tension, perhaps tears, perhaps anger, but not this cold. Steady, calm. She began to notice how isolated she felt in the wife's presence, how her own movements seemed out of place against the backdrop of such composed stillness. A woman who refuses to speak her thoughts often forces others to hear their own. This silence spread subtly through the household. Servants whispered less. Unsure of what the wife might already know, they moved more cautiously, fearing missteps that could expose loyalties they never intended to reveal. Daily chores continued. But the atmosphere had changed. The house felt suspended, waiting for something unnamed to happen. Silence. Once peaceful, now pressed against them like a closed door they could not open. The wife, however, did not rush this atmosphere. She let it grow at its own pace, understanding that tension without explanation could be more effective than direct demand. She watched the household adjust to her quiet, knowing that control does not always come from force. Sometimes it emerges from the refusal to react. In her stillness, she regained the authority others had assumed she lost. She gave nothing away. And because of that, no one could predict her next step. Even the husband began to feel the impact of her silence. He found himself questioning whether he had misjudged her response, wondering what thoughts she withheld, what plans she shaped in the background. His confidence faltered in the absence of emotion. He had prepared for confrontation, for accusations, for scenes that he believed would prove her irrational. Instead, she offered him nothing. Not reassurance, not anger, not explanation. This void unsettled him more deeply than any outburst could have. Silence revealed the fragility of the household more effectively than conflict. It exposed the gaps in loyalty, the hesitations in speech, the subtle rearrangement of authority. A wife who did not raise her voice held more influence than one who shouted, because her restraint forced everyone else to confront what they had chosen to ignore. The household sensed that the shift had begun, not through noise, but through the quiet that settled into every corner. Her silence reshaped the household long before anyone admitted that something had changed. Those who thought they understood her intentions realized they had misread the stillness entirely. What began without a single word would soon reach a point no one could quietly ignore. Her isolation did not begin with refusal or confrontation. It began with the steady rearrangement of daily life. Guided by a wife who understood that influence inside a Tudor household depended on routine rather than authority, the mistress still walked through the corridors, still appeared near the husband, still tried to hold her place. But the structure around her shifted in ways she could neither see nor control. The wife did not push her out. She simply removed the points of connection that allowed her to matter. The first changes appeared in the rhythm of interaction. Servants, who once spoke to the mistress freely, now altered their tone, offering shorter replies and avoiding unnecessary exchanges. They were not instructed to do so directly. Instead, they observed the wife's calm attention to their behavior, her silent presence when the mistress attempted to give small orders, her steady hand guiding tasks that once floated loosely between members of the staff. The wife reclaimed the daily decisions that shaped the household, and the servants adjusted themselves accordingly. Loyalty in a Tudor home rarely came from affection. It came from the recognition of who maintained order. As the servants' behavior shifted, so did the mistress's access to shared spaces. The wife arranged visits at unexpected hours, invited relatives who required particular rooms, and scheduled repairs in hallways the mistress favored. None of these changes appeared intentional, yet they created a pattern. Every time the mistress tried to settle into a place of comfort, she encountered a person, a task, or an obstacle that reminded her she did not belong there. The wife's presence filled the household even when she was not seen, because she shaped the flow of movement in ways the mistress could not anticipate. Meals became one of the clearest markers of separation. The mistress was not banned from joining, but the timing shifted subtly. Food was served earlier or later than she expected. Seating arrangements changed. Conversations began before she entered and ended when she arrived. What had once felt like inclusion now felt like intrusion. Each adjustment signaled to her, and to everyone watching, that her presence no longer fit naturally within the household structure. The wife also altered how information travelled. She redirected servants before the mistress could request anything. She delivered messages to the husband personally, leaving the mistress no opportunity to insert herself into his affairs. The small errands that once gave the mistress influence disappeared. She found herself waiting longer for responses, unaware that the wife had already handled the matters quietly. Influence faded not because she lost access to the husband, but because she no longer had access to the household through which that influence flowed. The servants, sensing the shift, mirrored the wife's attitudes. They began describing household matters vaguely when the mistress asked. They deferred to the wife even on questions the mistress believed she could handle. Their cautious distance came from practicality. The wife set the rules of daily life, and they knew the household functioned more smoothly under her guidance. A mistress, by contrast, brought uncertainty. Uncertainty that could jeopardize their work, their status, or their ability to remain unnoticed within the tensions of the home. Control of physical space further narrowed the mistress's presence. The wife organized storage rooms, adjusted servant schedules, and supervised household activities in ways that limited where the mistress could comfortably linger. Areas she once frequented grew crowded with tasks. Rooms she claimed as quiet retreats were now occupied by others. Even the courtyard, where she enjoyed brief moments alone, became the site of new chores the wife assigned. Nothing explicitly barred her from these places, but the constant activity reminded her that she was an outsider moving through someone else's structure. These changes had an accumulating effect. The mistress sensed her confidence slipping, unsure of where she was welcome or how she should behave. The household no longer acknowledged her attempts at familiarity. She became cautious, hesitating before entering rooms, lowering her voice around servants, and avoiding spaces where she felt exposed. Her isolation grew from the subtle absence of welcome rather than the presence of hostility. Meanwhile, the wife maintained her composure, managing the household with consistent steadiness. She offered no accusations, gave no warnings, and revealed no frustration. Her silence reinforced the legitimacy of her position, allowing the household to align naturally around her. In contrast, the mistress's discomfort grew more noticeable, making her seem less secure and more out of place with each passing day. This was the essence of the wife's strategy, to surround the mistress not with barriers but with emptiness. Influence faded when no one made space for it. Confidence dissolved when every step required justification. The household, once unsettled by the mistress's presence, now began to forget her place within it. The environment no longer responded to her intentions, only to the wife's unspoken design. What once felt like an opportunity slowly turned into a maze of quiet refusals and invisible limits. Within that shifting landscape, the mistress realized she stood increasingly alone. The servants of a Tudor household moved through its rooms with a quiet familiarity that no family member ever truly possessed. They carried trays, opened doors, prepared fires, and tended to chores that kept them close to every private corner. Nothing escaped their notice. They saw who entered which room, who whispered behind half-closed doors, and who avoided each other in the hall. They were the silent witnesses of the household, observing without intention, but always observing. Their knowledge formed an invisible thread connecting every part of the home. The wife understood this better than anyone. She did not question the servants harshly or demand their loyalty outright. Instead, she placed herself where their paths crossed, letting them see her calmness, her patience, her consistency. She allowed them to notice the steadiness with which she managed the household. Over time, the servants learned that order returned when they followed her lead. Loyalty built on observation lasted longer than loyalty forced by fear. They aligned themselves with the wife, not because they were commanded to, but because she represented the stability the household relied upon. Information in such a home did not spread through announcements. It moved through glances and whispers. A misplaced sigh from the mistress, a tense silence from the husband, a door closing too quickly. These small details became fragments of stories that servants carried between rooms. The wife recognized that controlling these stories did not require stopping the whispers. It required shaping what was whispered. So she adjusted her appearances in subtle ways, arriving in a room at just the right moment, pausing before speaking, letting her expression remain unreadable. These actions, seemingly insignificant, influenced how servants interpreted the household's tensions. When the mistress attempted to assert herself, her efforts were absorbed into a system already shaped by the wife. The servants noticed when the mistress grew impatient, when her voice sharpened, or when she stood in a place where she seemed out of context. They contrasted this with the wife's composed demeanor. In their recounting of daily events, even when unintentional, the mistress appeared unsettled while the wife appeared grounded. Servants rarely lied, they simply repeated what they saw. But perception, once formed, guided every retelling. The wife also understood that servants did not just observe. They evaluated. A single moment of weakness or impropriety could linger in their memories, resurfacing at unpredictable times. She kept her own behavior precise, never allowing them to misinterpret her actions. Her quiet presence became a standard they measured others against. When rumors began moving through the home, they often reflected the steadiness she projected. Information, when left without guidance, grows wild. When given direction, it becomes a tool. The mistress, sensing her shrinking influence, sought to speak with servants directly. She asked questions, hinted at her closeness to the husband, tried to recover the informal authority she once believed she held. But the servants responded cautiously. Their replies were short, their expressions neutral, their movements efficient but distant. They no longer granted her the small gestures of regard that made her feel relevant. She found herself talking into spaces that did not reflect her words to her. Even the husband, unaware of the shifts happening around him, experienced their consequences. Servants delivered his messages to the wife more promptly than to the mistress. They informed the wife of household concerns before approaching him. When he entered a room, the servant's stillness revealed a subtle judgment he could not decipher. They knew more than he wanted to imagine, and the knowledge they carried gave the wife leverage he did not fully understand. Control of information did not mean restricting communication. It meant guiding what people believed they had discovered on their own. A sideways glance from the wife at the right moment could plant doubt where certainty once lived. A deliberate pause before answering a question could redirect suspicion. The wife never voiced accusations. Yet servants began to interpret the mistress's presence through a lens she quietly crafted. The most powerful changes occurred without spoken words. Servants altered their behaviors based on assumptions they formed through observation. They avoided being alone with the mistress, kept their conversations short, and reported unusual activities to the wife without being instructed. Their caution created an atmosphere that magnified the mistress's isolation. She felt watched, though no one openly confronted her. She felt judged, though no one spoke against her. The lack of open hostility made the discomfort sharper. In this environment, a single whisper could erode a person's standing far more effectively than an accusation. A servant mentioning that the mistress looked anxious, or that the wife seemed unusually composed, was enough to reshape how others interpreted future events. The wife did not need to direct these whispers, she merely set conditions under which they would arise naturally. The truth mattered less than the pattern of impressions forming in everyone's minds. The mistress's identity within the household slowly shifted. She was no longer perceived as an influential figure near the husband, but as a troubling presence, lacking refinement, lacking authority, and lacking acceptance. The servant's quiet distance reinforced this transformation. Even the walls seemed to close around her, as she realized her place in the home was no longer defined by her closeness to the husband, but by the perception of those who moved through every unnoticed passage. The household now carried stories shaped by the wife's quiet guidance, not by the mistress's attempts at assertion. Each whisper echoed a version of events that left the mistress further from the center than she understood. And in that unspoken shift, the wife claimed control over the one force that could not be challenged directly. The transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded through small adjustments in behavior, the quiet redirection of attention, and the subtle reinforcement of what everyone already knew but rarely acknowledged. The mistress had no standing in the household. She stepped into rooms where people paused rather than greeted her, spoke into spaces that no one filled with reply, and moved through corridors where she sensed an absence that felt heavier than hostility. Her presence no longer blended into the home, it stood apart from it, marked by an unspoken awareness that she did not belong. The wife never stated this directly. She never pointed to the mistress and declared her position inferior. Instead, she emphasized her own role in ways that highlighted the difference. She attended to family documents, spoke with visiting relatives, managed the servants with steady authority, and received guests with the grace expected of someone who represented the household. Each task she performed reminded everyone that legitimacy was not just a matter of being present, it was a matter of being recognized. Recognition was something the mistress could never claim, no matter how close she stood to the husband. When visitors arrived, the distinction became even clearer. They greeted the wife first, addressed her with the appropriate titles, and waited for her to lead conversations. The mistress lingered at the edges of these gatherings, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. She received polite nods, but no invitations to join deeper discussions. Guests did not intentionally ignore her, they simply did not know how to place her. Without a title, without connection to lineage, without formal introduction, she hovered in a space that offered no security. Politeness protected her from insult, but not from exclusion. Within the household, the wife strengthened this perception with small, deliberate gestures. She positioned herself at the center of activities, overseeing meals, organizing the household accounts, and participating in seasonal rituals. Her presence was constant and purposeful. The mistress, by contrast, appeared as a temporary figure passing through these routines. She tried to participate, offering help or conversation, but her involvement felt misplaced, as though she was stepping into scenes already assigned to someone else. The household responded to her attempts with quiet discomfort. Social cues amplified the separation. Servants hesitated when she issued requests, unsure whether compliance would be noted by the wife. They addressed her without the deference given to someone with recognized status. They continued their work even when she lingered nearby, treating her not as a figure of authority, but as an observer. She noticed these reactions and interpreted them correctly. She carried no weight in the daily life of the home. Outside the household, the shift was even more pronounced. Word traveled quickly through Tudor society, especially among women who exchanged observations in churchyards, markets, and doorways. They spoke softly about the mistress, not out of kindness, but out of caution. No one wanted to appear sympathetic to someone who threatened another woman's marriage. Sympathy could be misinterpreted, and misinterpretation could lead to scandal. The mistress's reputation grew fragile, shaped by rumors she could not hear and judgments she could not contest. The wife contributed to this shift without speaking ill of the mistress. She simply maintained her composure in public, offered respectful greetings, and fulfilled her duties with visible restraint. Her behavior implied that she upheld dignity even as her household faced disruption. Observers admired her restraint and quietly sided with her. In doing so, they distanced themselves further from the mistress. Public opinion settled in a predictable pattern. The wife was wronged but dignified. The mistress was inappropriate and unwelcome. No explicit accusation was needed for society to take its position. Inside the home, the mistress felt the consequences as a tightening of space. She sensed the difference when she entered a room, and people straightened their posture. She heard the polite silence that followed her footsteps. She noticed the way conversations resumed the moment she stepped away. These moments accumulated until they shaped her entire experience. She no longer felt like someone participating in household life, but like someone interrupting it. The husband, preoccupied with his own concerns, failed to recognize the growing separation. He still viewed the mistress as someone whose presence brought comfort, unaware that the household now treated her as an intruder. His lack of awareness intensified her discomfort. She found herself unable to rely on him for support, knowing that appealing to him might worsen her vulnerability. Each day made her more aware of the precariousness of her place. The process of turning her into an outsider required no confrontation. It relied instead on the simple reinforcement of truth. She had no title, no lineage, no legal claim, and no rightful space within the home. The wife did not need to tell anyone this. Everyone already knew. Her strategy was to let that knowledge reshape interactions until the mistress felt the consequences deeply enough to doubt her own standing. Over time, the mistress's movements slowed. Her voice softened, and her confidence faded. She entered rooms hesitantly, stood near walls instead of near people, and lowered her gaze when addressed. She began to behave as though she were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The wife watched these shifts without triumph. Her goal had never been to humiliate the mistress, only to reveal the truth that society itself upheld. In the end, the household did not need to openly reject the mistress. She rejected herself, withdrawing emotionally and socially until she resembled a shadow rather than a presence. The home she tried to influence now reminded her of her own impermanence, each day shrinking the space she once claimed so boldly. Her absence carried a weight that reshaped how the household moved through its days. What once felt like a presence now faded into something barely acknowledged. A quiet realization began forming that her place in this home had already slipped beyond recovery. There came a point in the household when her departure no longer required action from anyone. The mistress still existed within the home, still walked through its corridors, still stepped into the same rooms. Yet each day her presence felt thinner, as though she were occupying less space than before. No conversation mentioned her absence. No command restricted her movements. And yet she understood with growing clarity that the life of the household had begun to continue without her. The transition was not abrupt. It was a slow drifting, unnoticed at first, then unmistakable. Daily routines revealed this shift most clearly. Tasks that once involved her no longer reached her hands. Servants greeted her politely but without intention, as though acknowledging a figure they no longer needed to account for. She attempted to linger near familiar rooms, hoping that someone might address her or grant her a place in ongoing activities. But the moments slipped by without recognition. The home that once felt unsettled by her presence now seemed strangely unaffected by her absence. The silence surrounding her made it impossible to understand where she still belonged. Even the husband's behavior reflected this quiet distancing. He spoke to her less frequently, not out of cruelty, but out of distraction. His attention had begun returning to estate matters, family obligations, and conversations with his wife that required his involvement. He did not push the mistress away. He simply failed to notice when she waited for acknowledgement. The gap widened not through conflict but through inattention. His priorities shifted naturally, and she found herself standing just outside his line of sight. The wife's influence appeared in these moments not through force, but through the steady restoration of order. She did not remove the mistress from gatherings, she merely filled the spaces before the mistress could step into them. She organized tasks that occupied the husband, restructured routines that eliminated opportunities for the mistress to linger near him, and maintained a calm authority that left little room for the mistress to assert herself. The wife's actions were subtle, but they gradually shaped an environment where the mistress found no anchor. Visitors deepened this estrangement without realizing it. When they entered the home, their attention centered naturally on the wife, who carried the rightful title and the composure expected of her role. The mistress, offering hesitant greetings from a corner or a corridor, received only polite acknowledgement. No one questioned why she stood apart, why she did not join conversations, or why her expressions hinted at uncertainty. Visitors simply focused on the figures who clearly belonged. The mistress, unanchored by status, drifted unnoticed through their presence. The servants, sensing this shift, adapted with practiced instinct. They guided guests toward the wife, directed questions to her, and filled their daily reports with details she needed. When the mistress asked about events or decisions, the servants responded briefly, offering only what had already become irrelevant. They did not intend to exclude her, they merely followed the path of influence that had already left her behind. Their behavior, quiet and consistent, signaled that she no longer played a role in the life of the home. The mistress felt the weight of this change most clearly, in moments when she found herself alone in rooms that once made her feel significant. She would wait for footsteps that never came, for conversations that no longer included her, for signs that her presence still mattered. The waiting itself became a reminder of her fading relevance. She began avoiding the wife's presence, not out of fear, but out of recognition that the wife did not need to confront her to diminish her place. The household structure had drawn its own boundaries. Each day made her withdrawal easier. She lingered less in central rooms, spent more time in distant corners, and avoided gatherings altogether. Her silence, once an attempt to remain unnoticed, turned into an admission that she no longer had anything to contribute. The home responded accordingly. Life moved around her rather than with her. Traditions resumed their patterns. The household found its balance again, not by rejecting the mistress outright, but by continuing without her involvement. Her disappearance from daily activities went unspoken. No one declared her unwelcome. No announcement marked her fading presence. Even the husband, if he noticed at all, interpreted her absence as a natural consequence of shifting responsibilities. The wife remained composed, allowing the household to return to its familiar rhythm. There was no victory in her expression, only a quiet steadiness that kept the home aligned with its rightful order. In the end, the mistress's diminishing presence did not require a decision or confrontation. It required only indifference. An indifference that grew stronger each time the household completed a task without her. Each time the wife stepped into a space she once occupied. Each time the husband turned his attention elsewhere. The home no longer pushed her away. It simply no longer remembered to make space for her. Her fading place settled quietly into the household's routine without resistance. Each day, one more thread was removed that once tied her to this home. What waited beyond this gradual unraveling would reshape how everyone understood her presence. The change in how the household viewed the mistress did not come from a direct accusation. It emerged through quiet contrasts, small observations, and the subtle reinforcement of expectations everyone already carried within them. The wife never pointed to the mistress and declared her improper. She simply allowed the differences between them to become more visible. In a Tudor home, where reputation shaped every relationship, even a slight shift in perception carried consequences that spread farther than words. The wife strengthened her own image first. She maintained her routines with precision, greeted servants calmly, oversaw household matters with measured care, and carried herself with composure that felt deliberate rather than performative. Her presence reminded everyone of the standard they expected from the mistress but never fully received. When people observed the wife's steadiness, they could not help comparing it to the mistress's unsettled behavior. Comparison rarely needed to be voiced. It formed naturally in the quiet of daily observation. The mistress, already isolated, struggled to present herself with the refinement expected of someone near the head of the household. Her discomfort showed in small ways, the restless movement of her hands, the uncertainty in her posture, the tension around her eyes when others entered the room. Servants noticed these details. Visitors noticed them too. The wife did nothing to hide these contrasts. She simply occupied her role with certainty, making the mistress's unease appear more out of place. Rumours did not need to spread loudly to damage the mistress's moral standing. A servant mentioning that she seemed overly familiar with the husband, a neighbour remarking on her presence during a gathering, or a relative raising an eyebrow at her lack of propriety. All these small comments shaped the narrative. They were not accusations, they were impressions. And impressions, once formed, rarely softened. Each whisper suggested that the mistress behaved in ways inappropriate for someone without a title, without legitimacy, without restraint. The wife reinforced this unspoken judgment through silence. When others mentioned the mistress in passing, the wife responded with measured neutrality. She offered no defense, no anger, no complaint. Her quiet acceptance created the impression that the situation spoke for itself. People interpreted her restraint as dignity, as patience, as moral strength. The mistress, standing in contrast, appeared impulsive, disruptive, and lacking the composure expected of a woman involved in a household of status. The wife also chose the moments when she appeared most visible. She stood beside her husband during formal events, spoke with authority when discussing family matters, and guided the household's decisions with clarity. These actions, though subtle, reminded everyone that the wife embodied the role of moral anchor. The mistress, without access to such responsibilities, seemed shallow in comparison. Someone whose relationship with the husband lacked purpose beyond desire. As these impressions settled into the household, the mistress found herself evaluated through a harsher lens. Her presence in certain rooms felt inappropriate. Her attempts to speak with servants seemed intrusive. Her gestures toward the husband appeared too intimate, too bold, too visible. None of these actions had changed. Yet they were interpreted differently because the household's perception had already shifted. A single misstep, even a small one, now carried the weight of confirmation. Outside the home, the shift was even more pronounced. People in the community learned of the situation through fragmented stories. They did not need details, they filled the gaps with assumptions. A mistress linked to a married man was already at a disadvantage. When whispers hinted at her impropriety, people accepted them quickly. They judged her not by her actions, but by what her presence symbolized. Respectable society turned its attention away. And with that withdrawal, her moral standing weakened further. The wife allowed this transformation to unfold naturally. She did not force the mistress into disgrace. She merely stepped into her own dignity fully enough that others noticed the difference. The contrast revealed what the mistress lacked. Even the husband sensed the strain, though he rarely acknowledged it openly. His interactions with the mistress grew guarded, shaped by an unease he could not articulate. Her influence faded not because of scandal, but because of erosion. Slow, subtle, and inevitable. Her image no longer carried the allure it once held, reshaped by the quiet judgments surrounding her. Each passing day deepened the sense that she occupied a position unworthy of the moral expectations of the home. A moment was nearing when even she would struggle to recognize the version of herself reflected in the household's gaze. Law and custom shaped every corner of a Tudor household, long before emotion ever entered it. Marriage was not merely a personal union, but a legal structure woven into property rights, inheritance rules, and societal expectations. Once a wife stepped into that structure, her position became fixed in ways a mistress could never approach. She did not need to fight for recognition. It was built into the very framework that defined family and community life. Her role existed in documents, ceremonies, and lineage, giving her a foundation stronger than her husband's shifting loyalties. The wife moved through this structure with quiet certainty. Her presence aligned naturally with what society expected: composure, responsibility, and adherence to tradition. Guests acknowledged her before speaking to anyone else. Relatives consulted her when discussing matters of lineage or estate. Officials addressing household disputes looked to her as the stable counterpart to the husband's authority. These interactions reinforced her legitimacy without her needing to emphasize it. Legitimacy survived on its own. It required no defense and no explanation. A mistress, by contrast, hovered outside every official boundary. She had no access to legal rights, no recognized purpose within the household, and no means to claim a lasting position. Her presence depended entirely on the husband's attention, which made her influence unstable even at its strongest. If he grew distant, she had nothing to fall back on. If the wife asserted her place, the mistress had no grounds to contest it. Servants understood this difference instinctively. They followed the wife's direction not because she demanded obedience, but because law and custom placed her at the center of the home's order. Society beyond the household reinforced these distinctions even more sharply. People valued stability, lineage, and appearances. A wife who maintained her dignity earned respect simply by fulfilling her role. A mistress, however reserved or polite, carried associations that society did not welcome. Women whispered about her in markets, churches, and gatherings. Men spoke cautiously, avoiding any perceived sympathy toward her. She lived under a quiet scrutiny that followed her wherever she went. No one needed to confront her. The social climate did that without effort. The wife allowed this natural current to work in her favor. She presented herself with calm restraint in public settings, avoiding gossip while offering courteous greetings. Her composure created an image of someone wronged yet dignified, someone who upheld the standards expected of her position. Observers admired this steadiness and silently sided with her. Without uttering a critical word, she gained moral ground that made the mistress appear more improper simply by comparison. Inside the home, customs became a form of authority. Household duties, managing servants, overseeing accounts, and preparing for seasonal events belonged inherently to the wife. She carried out these responsibilities with precision, reinforcing the idea that she maintained the structure of the household. The mistress, lacking any legitimate role, could not contribute in ways that mattered. Her influence drifted at the edges, emotional rather than practical. And emotional influence held little weight in a society deeply rooted in order and inheritance. Even the husband felt the pressure of these norms. His private preferences did not erase the expectations placed upon him. He was expected to sustain the marriage, protect the estate, and present a stable family image. Elevating the mistress publicly would have damaged his credibility and invited criticism from relatives, patrons, and officials. He might indulge his affection for her in private, but he could not reshape the household structure around her without inviting consequences that extended beyond personal life. The wife recognized this imbalance and used it patiently. She did not challenge the husband openly or accuse the mistress of impropriety. Instead, she allowed law and custom to define the boundaries. Neither of them could escape. She knew that the structure surrounding the household would always bend toward her position, not because she fought for it, but because society had already chosen her side. As these forces gathered quietly, the mistress felt the limits closing around her. She sensed the coolness in visitors' greetings, the hesitation in servants' responses, the subtle distance in the husband's behavior when others were present. Her role had no protection from public judgment. She could not appeal to documents, lineage, or moral expectation. Everything that granted the wife strength left the mistress exposed. Her place became more precarious with each passing day. She realized that her influence had never rested on firm ground, but on temporary acceptance shaped by desire rather than structure. The wife, without raising her voice or confronting her directly, allowed the weight of law and custom to reveal this truth. The mistress stood in a position that could be erased without ceremony, without legal consequence, and without the household needing to acknowledge her disappearance. Her vulnerability deepened as the household settled into its quiet order once more. What protected the wife also exposed how little ground the mistress could truly hold. Some consequence waited in the shadows, forming without warning and ready to turn the balance further. Influence inside a Tudor household rarely shifted through confrontation. It changed through quieter movements, where authority thinned without anyone raising their voice. A wife who understood the structure of her world did not attempt to overpower her husband openly. She recognized that a direct challenge could damage her own standing. Instead, she worked from within the household's natural rhythm, allowing trust, credibility, and emotional alliances to shift slowly away from him. This second step required patience rather than force, and it unfolded in ways the husband barely noticed until it was already in place. His authority depended heavily on the perception of control. Servants watched him closely, reading his tone, his habits, and his decisions. Relatives judged his stability by how he handled household matters. Even small lapses could create unease. The wife understood this unspoken system. She allowed moments of inconsistency to reveal themselves. When he forgot a scheduled meeting, others noticed. When he reacted impulsively, whispers carried through the halls. She did nothing to draw attention to these incidents, but she did nothing to soften them either. Credibility weakened most effectively when it suffered its own weight. Over time, the servants adjusted their instincts. They no longer looked to him first when uncertainty arose. They turned to the wife, who responded calmly and without hesitation. Her steadiness contrasted with the husband's shifting impulses, creating a quiet reorganization of trust. She did not correct him publicly or contradict him directly. She simply answered questions before he arrived or resolved small errors he overlooked. Each gesture seemed practical and harmless, but together they redirected the daily flow of authority toward her. His distance from the emotional core of the household grew just as subtly. A mistress once provided him with the illusion of companionship, but isolation formed when the wife strategically strengthened bonds with those he relied on. She encouraged servants to confide small concerns, listened to elderly relatives with patience, and supported those experiencing difficulties. People began to feel anchored to her presence. In contrast, the husband's interactions felt thinner, shaped by habit rather than genuine connection. No confrontation created this shift. It emerged naturally as people gravitated toward the person who made them feel heard. Even conversations within the household transformed. Servants shared information with the wife first, not by instruction but by instinct. They sensed her reliability and preferred to bring subtle problems to her attention. Those closest to the family followed the same pattern. When a minor crisis occurred, illness, financial confusion, or scheduling conflict, the wife responded before the husband fully understood the situation. He remained the formal head of the household, but the structure beneath him no longer relied on his judgment. His emotional alliances weakened as well. The mistress, once a source of escape, could not offer the stability he lost elsewhere. Her position grew unsteady, shaped by fear rather than confidence. She could not support him without exposing her own vulnerabilities. Her growing anxiety fed his frustration, leaving him stuck between someone who depended on him too heavily and someone who no longer needed him at all. The contrast made him feel displaced inside his own home, though no one had said anything to make him feel unwelcome. The wife deepened this sense of displacement by carefully managing household routines. She ensured tasks ran smoothly without his involvement. She organized gatherings, oversaw finances, and resolved disputes in a manner that left little space for him to assert influence. People praised her efficiency quietly, noting how dependable she remained under pressure. Their admiration placed the husband at an unspoken disadvantage. His authority existed, but his relevance felt increasingly symbolic. Subtle misalignments reinforced this disconnect. When he attempted to reclaim control, he found the household already functioning without him. When he offered a solution, the issue had been resolved earlier in the day. When he demanded updates, the servants addressed him politely, but without the same deference they once showed. Nothing appeared outwardly rebellious, yet everything indicated a shift. The wife had become the center of the home's emotional and practical stability, while he drifted toward the margins. This internal weakening created conditions that the mistress could not navigate. Her influence faded as his authority diminished. Without confidence in himself, he could not offer protection or favor to her. He grew irritable, uncertain, and defensive, distancing himself from the very person who once held his attention. The wife had not sabotaged their relationship directly. She had simply allowed its imbalance to reveal itself. A bond built on secrecy and desire could not endure under the weight of mounting instability. As the husband lost emotional support, he also lost the ability to sway the household. Conversations excluded him naturally. Decisions happened without him. People trusted the wife not because she overpowered him, but because she embodied the structure they depended on. His role remained recognized, but the influence behind it slipped away piece by piece. His influence thinned quietly as the household shifted its weight towards steadier hands. What once felt certain slipped away, while trust gathered in places he no longer controlled. One silent turning point waited ahead, ready to reveal how isolation had begun long before he noticed. Isolation inside a Tudor household rarely arrived with noise. It settled slowly, tightening its hold in the small spaces a man assumed he controlled. A husband who believed he moved freely through his own home did not always understand how much of that freedom depended on perception rather than strength. He expected loyalty from servants, predictability from relatives, and quiet compliance from the structure surrounding him. Yet the shift happened long before he realized the ground beneath him had weakened. What looked like independence from his perspective appeared very different to those observing him each day. Servants were often the first to sense the change. Their lives depended on reading tension, anticipating conflict, and adjusting to new currents without drawing attention. They noticed the way decisions became inconsistent, how instructions contradicted one another, how the husband's temper surfaced at unexpected moments. None of these signs alone seemed significant, but together they created uncertainty. The wife did nothing to highlight these inconsistencies. She simply offered clarity where he did not. People gravitated towards steadiness without announcing why. Isolation began when trust migrated quietly from one person to another. His influence weakened each time the household excluded him unintentionally. A dinner arrangement finalized without his input. A financial matter resolved before he reviewed it. Or a family discussion completed before he entered the room. All of it created gaps he could not identify precisely. No one corrected him. But no one waited for him either. The household moved smoothly, and his participation felt optional rather than essential. He mistook this for freedom. In truth, it marked his gradual removal from the center of authority. Relatives adjusted their behavior as well. When disagreements emerged, they approached the wife instead. Confident that she would respond calmly, she listened with patience, considered the details, and addressed matters efficiently. Her involvement reassured them. While the husband's unpredictability created hesitation, their support shifted without argument, without confrontation, and without the husband even noticing the change. Familiarity favored the wife. Reliability solidified her position further. The wife did not engineer this shift through open manipulation. She relied on the quiet structure surrounding her. Tradition, expectation, and the natural alignment of the household. She allowed the husband's missteps to stand on their own. She corrected what mattered, ignored what did not, and focused on maintaining stability. People associated order with her presence, not his. This connection formed slowly but firmly, turning her into the center around which the household revolved. The mistress, once a source of emotional escape for the husband, contributed unknowingly to his isolation. Her anxieties grew as her position weakened, and she demanded reassurance he could not provide. He felt trapped between her fear and his wife's composure, pulled increasingly toward the stability he once overlooked. Yet returning to the wife emotionally was no longer simple. She had built her strength inward, aligning herself with the household rather than with him. Her calmness made his uncertainty more visible. Small moments accumulated. Servants hesitated before answering him, unsure whether he still controlled certain matters. Visitors addressed the wife first. Even in the husband's presence, documents reached her hands before his. These gestures were polite on the surface, but each one chipped away at the authority he believed he still possessed. He walked through the halls, assuming people deferred to him out of respect. They deferred out of habit, but acted out of alignment with their wives. He remained unaware of how far he had drifted from the center of his own home. Freedom felt comfortable to him. Fewer responsibilities, fewer confrontations, fewer expectations. Yet the absence of responsibility was not liberation. It signaled irrelevance. The home no longer needed him for its decisions, rhythms, or stability. That absence formed a quiet boundary around him, not designed to punish, but inevitable as the household reshaped itself around steadier influence. The wife observed this shift with the same calm detachment she applied to every part of her strategy. She did not humiliate him, did not expose his weaknesses, did not seek victory through conflict. She simply allowed the structure of the household to tilt naturally toward her. In doing so, she became the anchor, and he became a figure whose authority existed more in title than in substance. His world tightened quietly as the house placed its trust elsewhere. What he mistook for personal freedom deepened into a distance he no longer controlled. Some quiet shift lingered beneath the household surface, preparing to reveal how far the balance had already moved. The distance between a husband and his mistress did not appear suddenly. It formed slowly, shaped by pressures he did not acknowledge and expectations he could not ignore. Inside a Tudor household, every personal attachment carried weight, and the relationship he believed offered escape eventually became a burden he struggled to carry. A wife who understood this dynamic did not interfere openly. She allowed society, to routine, and quiet observation to reshape the connection on their behalf. What once felt thrilling to him began to feel heavy, and what once felt promising to the mistress started to collapse under the same strain. Social pressure often arrived first. A mistress lived outside the protection of formal roles, and her presence invited scrutiny, no matter how discreet she tried to be. Servants whispered cautiously about the moments she lingered too long near him. Relatives watched the husband's behavior with growing concern, knowing that any misstep could damage the reputation of the family. The wife did not feed these opinions, but she did not soften them either. By presenting herself calmly in public and fulfilling her duties without complaint, she guided sympathy toward her side. People interpreted her composure as quiet endurance, and they instinctively judged the husband more harshly. Eventually, he felt the subtle shift. Invitations to gatherings arrived with gentle reminders to bring your wife. Conversations became strained when the mistress entered a room, Associates hesitated to acknowledge her, fearing the implication of familiarity. These reactions made the husband uncomfortable. He began calculating the consequences of every appearance. Every rumor, every small decision. The relationship that once offered relief from household pressure now created tension wherever he went. Burden replaced indulgence. And he sensed the change before he fully understood it. Inside the home, the contrast grew sharper. The wife moved steadily through the rhythm of daily life, managing accounts, guiding servants, and organizing routines that kept the estate stable. Her presence reminded him of responsibility, reliability, and continuity. The mistress offered none of these. Her dependence increased as her position weakened, and she reached for reassurance more often than before. He responded with impatience, caught between protecting her and preserving his own stability. Moments that once felt intimate became reminders of risk. The wife did not intervene directly. She simply allowed circumstances to reveal themselves. When the husband faced a decision requiring careful judgment, he turned toward her instinctively, knowing she would respond with clarity. When complications arose within the household, she resolved them before he arrived, reinforcing her central role. Each instance reminded him of what he valued in her, but rarely acknowledged: strength without confrontation and authority without noise. The mistress seemed smaller each time he compared them, though he never admitted this aloud. As public disapproval grew, his affection for the mistress became harder to justify. He began limiting their meetings, not out of resolve, but out of discomfort. He avoided situations where others might see them together, creating distance even when they remained in the same house. She felt the withdrawal immediately. Her laughter quieted. Her confidence slipped. The foundation of their relationship, once built on secret attention, now rested on fear of exposure. She sensed that every gesture he offered now carried hesitation. This hesitation deepened into emotional distance. He no longer confided in her easily. He spoke in shorter sentences, avoided sensitive topics, and left conversations unfinished. The mistress tried to repair the connection, but her attempts only reminded him of the fragile position she occupied. She had no social standing to support him, no legitimate influence to stabilize his reputation, and no authority to protect herself. Their bond had always been an indulgence. Now it became a threat. The wife observed the shift with quiet certainty. She did not need to confront either of them. She simply maintained her composure, allowing the structure of the household to enforce the distance she intended. Her steadiness turned the mistress into a symbol of disruption rather than desire, and people aligned themselves naturally with the figure who represented order. As the husband pulled away, the mistress began to feel isolated even when he was physically near her. She noticed how his gaze drifted toward doorways, how he hesitated before offering comfort, how he ended conversations more abruptly. She realized he no longer protected her from scrutiny. His silence became a barrier she could not cross. The affection she relied upon was still present in flickers, but it no longer shielded her. Pressure intensified when minor issues spiraled into larger concerns. A single rumor spread more widely than expected. A passing comment reached the wrong relative. A careless gesture raised suspicion at a gathering. Each incident pushed him further from the mistress and closer to the order maintained by his wife. He felt trapped between two contrasting worlds, one steady and socially reinforced, the other exposed and increasingly dangerous. In time, the mistress sensed what the wife had long understood. The husband's loyalty shifted with the weight of consequence. He began prioritizing dignity, reputation, and stability over admiration or desire. Distance hardened into habit. He visited her less often, offered fewer reassurances, and withdrew with an apologetic tone she recognized as resignation. The connection that once gave him escape now pressed against him like a tightening grip. What began as secrecy turned into a strain he could no longer justify. pressure continued to build beneath their failing bond. Preparing to force a deeper break, neither of them could prevent. Dependence inside a Tudor household rarely appeared as a dramatic shift. It formed through daily patterns, through quiet reminders of who sustained the structure and who merely moved within it. A husband who once believed he could navigate between household responsibilities and private desires eventually discovered how much of his stability relied on the foundations maintained by his wife. She did not force this realization. She allowed the weight of the estate, the demands of tradition, and the expectations of society to press toward him until he could not ignore how essential her role had become. Management of property was the first point where this truth revealed itself. Estates required careful calculation, knowledge of seasonal cycles, and familiarity with long-standing obligations. The wife understood every ledger, every arrangement with tenants, every recurring cost needed to keep the household functioning. When small issues arose, such as late payments, supply shortages, and disputes between workers, she addressed them with precision. The husband, preoccupied and distracted, let these details slip through his grasp. His attempts to intervene sometimes created more confusion. Servants noticed this, and they turned naturally back to the wife for clarity. Stability strengthened around her because she provided what he could not. Control of resources expanded this dependence. Food stores, textiles, rents, wages, and seasonal reserves all passed through her hands. She knew what needed to be purchased, what needed to be repaired, and what needed to be replaced. The husband relied on her summaries, trusting her to present accurate assessments because she had proven reliable over time. When he attempted to make decisions without consulting her, consequences followed, such as miscalculations, overlooked details, or strained relationships with suppliers. Each misstep reminded him that the household functioned smoothly only when she guided its internal rhythm. The wife reinforced this truth without speaking it aloud. She allowed him to see the contrast between his uncertainty and her steadiness. She maintained order in a way that appeared almost effortless, though it came from years of understanding the home's inner mechanics. Her calm presence made the household feel secure. While his impulses created unpredictability, people leaned toward the steadier figure unconsciously, and the husband eventually did the same. Tradition shaped the next layer of dependence. Tudor society expected a wife to uphold the moral and logistical structure of the home. When relatives visited, they approached her first, confident she would know how to manage lodging, meals, and conversation. When seasonal responsibilities approached, harvest distribution, winter preparation, or ceremonial gatherings, she organized them as naturally as breathing. These traditions reinforced her centrality. He realized that if she stepped away, the order holding the family together would loosen immediately. The mistress, by contrast, existed entirely outside this framework. She could provide affection but not structure, closeness but not stability. The more pressure the household experienced, the more clearly the husband recognized this distinction. He needed order, predictability, and legitimacy, elements only his wife could supply. Dependence emerged not from emotional attachment, but from necessity. She offered what society demanded from him, even when he drifted away from his responsibilities. Gradually, his behavior shifted. He came to her more often for updates, advice, and reassurance. He relied on her judgment when facing decisions that carried long-term consequences. The wife did not outwardly celebrate this shift. She simply responded with the same steady tone she always used. Her composure reinforced the impression that she had never lost control. Even during the most turbulent moments, dependence felt natural, almost inevitable, as if returning to the order the household had always required. Servants adjusted accordingly. They mirrored the wife's authority by consulting her before approaching the husband, When he made a choice that contradicted established routines, they glanced toward her for silent confirmation. Their loyalty followed the structure that worked, and it became clear to everyone that she was the true anchor. The husband sensed this dynamic each time he entered a room where the activity remained steady regardless of his presence. The household functioned with or without him, but it faltered when the wife withdrew even briefly. This realization reshaped his interactions with the mistress as well. She reminded him of moments of escape, but escape no longer felt sustainable. He could not rely on her to stabilize his world. The rising pressure of responsibility pushed him back toward the person who maintained the framework he depended on. Conversations with the mistress felt strained, while conversations with the wife felt necessary. He recognized the difference, but avoided acknowledging it openly. The wife allowed this understanding to deepen at its own pace. She continued guiding the household quietly, never claiming credit, never demanding recognition. Her control was rooted in function, not performance. The more he relied on her, the more irrelevant the mistress's presence became. Dependence softened his resistance, reshaped his priorities, and drew him back toward the structure he once underestimated. His world settled again around the person who kept it intact when everything else slipped. What once felt optional turned into the foundation he could not step away from. A quiet shift gathered within the household, ready to expose how deeply the balance had already tilted. Sympathy inside a Tudor community often moved quietly, guided not by dramatic gestures, but by the steady weight of observation. A wife who understood this dynamic did not attempt to persuade anyone directly. She allowed people to watch, to compare, and to draw conclusions on their own. Her strength came from restraint, not accusation. Her calm presence, even when the household shifted around her, shaped how society interpreted every conflict whispered behind closed doors. The more she held her composure, the more others aligned themselves with her without needing to be asked. The appearance of endurance mattered deeply in this world. Emotional outbursts were read as instability, while steadiness implied dignity. The wife walked through markets, gatherings, and church aisles with deliberate quietness. She carried herself as someone who accepted the burdens of her position without bitterness. People noticed the simplicity of her dress, the modesty of her speech, and the care she offered to those within her household. These details built an image more persuasive than any spoken defense. Sympathy formed naturally when people recognized perseverance without complaint. Her moral steadiness reinforced this perception. She upheld the traditions expected of her, managed duties with consistency, and treated others with patience. Relatives admired her for maintaining order despite private difficulties. Neighbors respected the way she separated personal struggle from public responsibility. Even servants, who observed the most intimate moments of the home, recognized the distinction between her calm authority and the uncertainty surrounding the husband and his mistress. Their quiet respect contributed to the narrative others gradually adopted. The mistress, by contrast, could not escape the social limitations placed upon her. Every action she took, no matter how harmless, was interpreted through suspicion. People questioned her motives, doubted her sincerity, and avoided forming loyalties with someone who lacked status. Her presence alone stirred discomfort. When she appeared in public, eyes lingered too long on her gestures. Her clothing, her expression, she carried a burden that intensified each time the wife maintained composure. Comparison worked against her, even without deliberate intention. The husband, already weakened by internal shifts in the household, contributed unknowingly to this imbalance. His inconsistencies, impulsive choices, and emotional distance made him appear unreliable. People sympathized with the wife for enduring these challenges while still fulfilling her duties. The more his behavior faltered, the more dignified she seemed. Her silence became a mirror reflecting his instability, sharpening public perception without any need for confrontation. The wife used this movement subtly. She did not seek pity. She simply showed up where she was expected, with relatives at gatherings, with community members during seasonal charity, with church groups during observances. Her presence signaled responsibility. When others approached her with concern, she responded with a measured tone that avoided both bitterness and self-praise. This restraint allowed people to fill the gaps themselves, shaping a narrative that portrayed her as the wronged yet resilient figure of the household. Small gestures strengthened this perception further. She comforted distressed servants, offered assistance to elderly neighbors, and supported younger relatives with quiet advice. These acts were not dramatic, but they left impressions that lingered long after she left the room. People repeated them in conversations, adding weight to her reputation. Even those who had once remained neutral began viewing her as the stabilizing force holding the household together. As sympathy shifted toward her, pressure settled around the husband and his mistress. They sensed the change in how others greeted them, in how conversations faltered, in how glances sharpened with judgment. The mistress felt it most intensely. She realized her presence in the household no longer carried allure, it carried discomfort. The husband felt the weight as well, aware that his standing diminished each time his wife appeared composed beside him. The wife continued to navigate these moments with quiet precision. She neither exaggerated her role nor exposed their weaknesses. She allowed society to conclude what it observed, her steadiness, their instability, and the contrast that grew sharper with every passing week. She understood that sympathy, once secured, fortified her position more effectively than confrontation ever could. By the time the shift became fully visible, she had already earned the trust of those who mattered. Relatives, community members, to servants, and even distant observers who knew only fragments of her story. Her influence no longer needed defense. It expanded naturally, rooted in the perception that she embodied dignity where others lost control. Her quiet endurance reshaped how the household was seen far beyond its walls. What others interpreted as patience turned into the core of her emerging strength. Some deeper consolidation of influence lingered ahead, waiting to surface as the balance continued to shift. Power inside a Tudor household did not always belong to the loudest voice or the most forceful hand. It often settled instead in the quiet resilience of the one who endured the longest. A wife who had been sidelined, ignored, or overshadowed did not need to reclaim her place through confrontation. She understood that the household watched her more closely than the husband or the mistress realized. Every gesture she made, every calm response she offered, shaped how people interpreted the shifting balance within the home. What appeared to be weakness at first gradually revealed itself as a different kind of influence. Steady, controlled, and far more lasting. Retaliation never served her purpose. An open display of anger would have damaged the composure she had cultivated. Instead, silence allowed her to frame the narrative without speaking a word. Servants noted the consistency of her behavior, the steadiness with which she fulfilled her responsibilities, and the dignity she maintained even when others acted carelessly around her. They adjusted their loyalties instinctively, drawn to the figure who radiated stability rather than turmoil. Patience became her most precise weapon, cutting more sharply than any accusation could. The husband, already weakened by internal tensions, contributed unintentionally to her ascent. His missteps contrasted sharply with her restraint. His impulsive decisions highlighted her discipline. His entanglement with the mistress illuminated her reliability. Over time, he depended on her quiet judgment more than he wished to admit, turning to her not because he wanted to, but because he needed the order she sustained. Dependence softened whatever power he believed he still held, leaving space for her presence to grow. The mistress felt this shift even sooner. Her position, once thrilling and secretive, became strained under the weight of the wife's patience. She noticed how the household responded to the wife with confidence. How relatives offered small gestures of encouragement. How servants gravitated toward the person who created calm instead of chaos. The mistress felt exposed. She realized that being chosen by her husband did not grant her lasting influence. Being respected by the household did, and respect flowed toward the wife. Not her. The wife never sought sympathy directly. Yet sympathy arrived all the same. Society admired endurance more than defiance. People repeated her name with quiet approval, praising her composure and reliability. Those who once remained neutral began assuming she was the moral center of the conflict. The more they observed her measured actions, the more they believed she deserved their support. Reputation grew not from dramatic claims, but from a steady presence. Time amplified these perceptions. Weeks of consistency became months, and the image of the wife as the stabilizing force solidified. Her authority did not expand through bold declarations. It grew through repetition. Every day, she performed her duties. She reinforced the idea that she alone upheld the household structure. The husband appeared increasingly peripheral. The mistress seemed dangerously fragile. The wife, by contrast, seemed unshakable. Even within the private spaces of the home, her influence deepened. Decisions that once flowed through the husband now passed through her instead. Servants brought her information before seeking his approval. Relatives asked her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with household management, but everything to do with trust. The wife's control, once subtle, became woven into the routine. No one questioned it. The shift felt natural, almost inevitable, as if the home had simply adjusted to its rightful center. The husband sensed this reorganization, but could not stop it. Each attempt to reassert himself only highlighted how much authority he had lost. His frustration softened into resignation. The mistress, alarmed by the shifting dynamic, attempted to bolster her influence, but lacked the foundation to do so. Every effort she made seemed reactive and anxious. Meanwhile, the wife continued her quiet consistency, allowing others to draw their own conclusions without any visible effort on her part. Time remained her greatest ally. She let situations unfold, trusting that endurance would outlast impulse. She did not rush to reclaim her power. She let it return to her naturally. Those who once doubted her eventually recognized that she had never lost her position. She had simply waited for the household to remember where its stability truly resided. Her transformation from betrayed figure to central authority did not arrive with celebration or proclamation. It emerged like a shift in the air, noticeable only when people realized the old order had already dissolved. By then, her influence had taken root too deeply to challenge. Her silence became the force that reoriented the entire household. What once seemed fragile revealed itself as the foundation others relied upon. A further shift gathered quietly beneath the surface, preparing to pull even more influence toward the figure no one expected to rise again. Reordering power inside a Tudor household never happened through announcements. It emerged through subtle shifts in daily rhythm, where authority moved toward the person capable of sustaining stability. As the husband's influence weakened and the mistress's presence faded into uncertainty, the wife stepped into a structure she had been quietly reinforcing for months. She did not seize control abruptly. She allowed the household to reshape itself around her, aligning each part of its routine with her steady hand. Control of the daily rhythm formed the core of this transformation. Meals, schedules, correspondence, seasonal duties, and social obligations all flowed naturally through her oversight. She set the pace of mornings, guided the distribution of tasks, and managed the transitions between one responsibility and the next. Servants adjusted their movements according to her timing. Relatives respected her structure without question. Even the husband, once accustomed to directing the rhythm of the household, found himself following patterns she had created. Power accumulated in her direction simply because she kept the house moving when others faltered. The husband's influence diminished further as the wife's role expanded. His presence still mattered in name. But the decisions he once handled slipped away quietly. When servants encountered conflict or uncertainty, they approached the wife first, trusting her clarity. When matters required stability, or finance, dispute, or negotiations, she resolved them before he had the opportunity to intervene. Her competence exposed the fragility of his authority. Without confrontation, without criticism, she demonstrated that the household relied on her, not him, to maintain order. This reduction of influence was not punishment. It was the natural result of imbalance. The husband had distanced himself emotionally and practically, long before the wife allowed the structure to correct itself. His involvement became optional rather than essential. When he attempted to assert himself, he discovered that routines already functioned perfectly without his direction. He stepped back, because stepping in made the household less stable, not more. His relevance faded in the quiet spaces he no longer inhabited. The wife used this shift not to elevate herself alone, but to strengthen the broader family network surrounding her. Children, once peripheral to internal decision-making, began to play more visible roles. She involved them in small responsibilities, managing personal possessions, assisting with correspondence, and observing household routines. Through these tasks, they learned the structure she upheld. Their growing involvement added depth to her authority, making the household feel more unified under her guidance. Relatives on her side of the family gained influence as well. Their presence at gatherings grew more frequent. They offered advice, assisted with seasonal preparations, and provided support in ways the husband's family once did. The wife nurtured these bonds, knowing that allies shaped both perception and stability. Their involvement reinforced her position in the eyes of the community and created a network of loyalty stronger than the one the husband had relied upon. This reorganization did not exclude the husband entirely. Instead, it placed him in a role shaped by the boundaries he created through his own actions. He became a figure whose authority existed primarily in title. His decisions carried weight only when they aligned with the structure the wife established. Over time, even he recognized the comfort this brought. The household felt more predictable, more orderly, more cohesive under her guidance. Resistance gave way to reluctant acceptance, and acceptance gradually settled into dependence. The mistress, observing from a distance, felt the consequences more painfully. As the wife strengthened connections around her, the mistress's presence became increasingly irrelevant. She held no place in this new structure. She could not influence schedules, participate in decisions, or align herself with the networks the wife cultivated. The more the family unified, the more isolated she became. Her significance dwindled until her presence felt like a temporary disruption rather than a lasting force. The wife, meanwhile, continued to act with quiet precision. She did not boast of her influence or display dominance. She simply ensured that every part of the house moved with coherence. Her measured tone, steady movements, and consistent judgment became the pulse of the household. People relied on her not because they feared her, but because she never failed them. Power, once scattered, gathered around her presence. Servants responded to her voice first. Children shaped their routines according to her expectations. Relatives offered support with genuine loyalty. The husband drifted toward the perimeter of his own home, while she stepped naturally into its center. This was not a triumph in the loud sense. It was the culmination of months of quiet realignment. By the time the transformation became visible, the household had already settled into its new order. She did not need to declare authority. It resided in her actions, her consistency, and the structure she rebuilt. Her guidance became the framework the family depended on, steady in every shift. What once belonged to the husband in name alone moved silently into her hands. Further change waited at the edges of this new order. Ready to reveal what remained after influence, rearranged itself completely. When the mistress finally slipped out of the household, quietly, without farewell, without a place to return to, what remained was not a space, but a rebalanced order settling into place. Her absence did not erase the disruption she once caused, nor did it restore the household to its former state. Instead, it revealed what had changed during the long tension she had introduced. The home did not return to what it had been. It evolved into something shaped by endurance, patience, and the steady influence of the wife who had waited for the storm to pass. Restoration of family dignity arrived slowly, not through celebration but through the soft recalibration of how people behaved. Servants spoke more freely again, moving through the corridors without the hesitation that had shadowed them. Relatives who once avoided the household now visited without discomfort. Conversations regained a natural tone, no longer clouded by the presence of someone who existed outside the boundaries of legitimacy. Stability returned, not because the mistress disappeared, but because the household recognized who had held it steady all along. The wife did not change her demeanor. She remained measured, calm, and composed. She neither gloated nor showed relief. Her silence maintained the dignity she had protected throughout the turmoil. People respected her more deeply for that restraint. They acknowledged her endurance with gestures, longer greetings, warmer tones, thoughtful glances, and small acknowledgments that she had weathered something difficult without losing her stability. The home subtly aligned itself around her presence, recognizing her as the figure who had preserved its dignity. The husband, however, did not emerge unchanged. His reputation carried fractures that could not be easily concealed. People remembered the rumors, the inconsistencies, the public discomfort that had followed him. They remembered how his decisions faltered, how his emotional uncertainty affected the household. Even after the mistress's departure, traces of that instability lingered. The slight hesitation in his voice, the guarded tone he used when speaking to relatives, the discomfort he felt in gatherings where his authority once went unquestioned. He sensed these fractures more sharply than anyone else. The mistress's absence did not free him. It exposed how much of his influence had already dissolved. Without her as a distraction, he faced the hollow spaces left behind. Relationships he had neglected, duties he had abandoned, trust he had allowed to erode. He felt the distance between himself and the household more distinctly. His attempts to reassert control often faltered, not because others resisted him, but because they had learned not to rely on him. The wife did not humiliate him for these weaknesses. She simply continued the work she had always done, managing the estate, maintaining the rhythm of daily life, guiding the household toward predictability. Her consistency highlighted the contrast between them. Where he hesitated, she acted. Where he faltered, she steadied the path. People looked to her not because she demanded it, but because she proved, again and again, that she was the one capable of holding the structure intact. A new order formed around this recognition. The wife's influence became the quiet center of the household. Children approached her first with their concerns. Servants relied on her instructions without questioning their clarity. Relatives treated her as the anchor of the family, trusting her judgment over the husband's. These shifts did not require formal declarations. They unfolded naturally as the household recalibrated itself after months of instability. The mistress's absence also revealed the fragility of alliances built on secrecy. Her presence had created a tension that shaped every interaction, every decision, every whispered opinion. With her gone, that tension dissolved, leaving behind a lesson that touched everyone in the home. Power dependent on desire was temporary, but power rooted in legitimacy and patience endured. The wife embodied that endurance, and the household recognized it without needing to articulate it. The husband's diminished authority became part of this new order. People did not challenge him openly, but they no longer deferred to him instinctively. His voice carried less weight. His decisions felt tentative. His attempts to regain dominance lacked the confidence they once held. Even he understood that the household no longer revolved around him. He had become a figure present in title, but not in influence. The wife's central position, meanwhile, did not emerge through force, but through the quiet accumulation of trust. She had carried the household when it wavered, steadied it when it fractured, and guided it through the aftermath without demanding acknowledgement. That steadiness allowed the home to breathe again, free from the conflict that once shadowed every corner. By the time the new order fully settled, the absence of the mistress felt less like the loss of a person and more like the removal of a distortion. What remained was clarity, of roles, of loyalty, of influence. The wife did not simply resume her place, she expanded it. The husband did not simply lose authority, he returned to a diminished version of it. The household did not simply recover, it reshaped itself entirely. Silence filled the spaces where conflict once lived, settling over a home that had learned who carried its weight. What had fractured slowly, realigned around the figure who never lost her footing. Another shift waited quietly ahead, revealing what this new balance would mean for every life within those walls. Psychological consequences rarely arrived with clarity inside a Tudor household. They surfaced in fragments. Hesitation in a step, silence before a reply, or the uneasy glance of someone who once moved with confidence. For the husband, the departure of the mistress did not bring relief. It exposed the subtle fractures he had tried to ignore. The household he once believed he controlled no longer responded to him as it once did. And the absence of distraction forced him to confront a reality he had avoided. His authority had thinned. His influence had shifted, and people watched him differently now. The sense of being observed settled over him slowly. Servants paused before answering, measuring their tone carefully. Relatives greeted him politely, but without warmth. Even the slightest misstep, a misplaced remark, a late decision, a visible moment of frustration, felt amplified under the new scrutiny. He became aware of how often eyes followed him through corridors, not with fear or admiration, but with quiet evaluation. Every gesture became something others interpreted, whether he intended it or not. This constant monitoring changed his relationship to the spaces he once navigated freely. Rooms that had felt familiar now seemed charged with expectation. He entered them cautiously, unsure of what others anticipated from him. He noticed whispers that stopped too quickly, conversations that shifted when he approached, and glances exchanged behind lowered lids. These subtle reactions created a sense of distance he could not ignore. The home had begun to treat him as an unpredictable figure, someone whose decisions required containment rather than trust. His mistrust extended inward as well. Where he had once believed in the possibilities of relationships outside his marriage, now he saw only risk. The experience with the mistress had exposed how fragile those connections were. Attention, once thrilling, now seemed dangerous. Affection, once intoxicating, now felt like a vulnerability he could not afford. He no longer sought comfort in secrecy. Secrecy had become the force that unraveled his authority. What had once drawn him forward now pulled him back, leaving him wary of his own impulses. This wariness altered how he interacted with the world beyond his home. He avoided lingering conversations, cautious that someone might misinterpret his tone. He declined invitations that once excited him, worried about how they might reflect on him. Even casual interactions carried weight he could not easily shed. He had learned that trust was not guaranteed, and once broken, it could not be repaired simply by returning to old habits. People remembered, even when they pretended not to. Inside the home, caution shaped his movements. He approached decisions with hesitation, aware that the household no longer deferred to him instinctively. He waited for the wife's input more often than he admitted, uncertain whether his judgment would be seen as competent. This dependence frustrated him. yet he could not deny its necessity. She understood the rhythm of the home in a way he no longer did. Her steady presence magnified his uncertainty, making him feel peripheral even when he attempted to reassert his role. He also became acutely aware of the distance between himself and those who once aligned with him. Servants who formerly sought his approval now looked toward the wife for guidance. Relatives who once admired his confidence treated him with gentle restraint, as though protecting him from further missteps. Even his own children observed him with a quiet caution, sensing the tension beneath his composed surface. These reactions deepened his sense of isolation, reminding him that regaining trust required far more than time. The emotional weight of this shift grew heavier as he recognized how deeply the household had rearranged itself. The wife no longer needed to assert power. She embodied it. Her calm steadiness shaped the environment around her. He saw how naturally others relied on her, how instinctively they adjusted themselves to her guidance. Her presence intensified his awareness of what he had lost. Not just influence, but certainty. She represented the order he could not restore on his own. As the weeks passed, he adopted a new posture, more restrained, more deliberate, more cautious. He monitored his tone, moderated his reactions, and hesitated before asserting himself. He feared causing further disruption, feared being judged, and feared losing what remained of his role. The confidence that once propelled him had eroded into vigilance. He watched others before speaking, measured their responses before acting, and questioned his own instincts more than ever. What lingered beneath these changes was a quiet resignation. He understood that the household no longer centered around him. Influence had shifted gradually but unmistakably toward the wife, and his attempts to reclaim it felt shallow compared to the depth of what she had built. He did not resist the new order, he simply adapted to it, hoping to avoid further fractures. Silence replaced defiance. Caution replaced impulse. And reflection replaced certainty. Every room now echoed with the consequences he carried alone. What once felt like authority had turned into something fragile, something easily disturbed. A deeper reckoning waited quietly ahead, preparing to uncover what remained of the man behind the title. Weakness inside a Tudor household rarely appeared through collapse. It unfolded through small shifts, moments that seemed harmless on the surface, yet gathered weight over time. The husband, once confident in his authority, did not lose power through scandal or public disgrace. Nothing dramatic marked his decline. Instead, his influence thinned quietly, shaped by restraint rather than opposition. The wife never sought to destroy him. She understood that the structure surrounding them would weaken him naturally once she stopped reinforcing what he no longer deserved. There were no loud confrontations, no public accusations, no scenes that left witnesses whispering for days. The wife never raised her voice. She never exposed his failures. She simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. For years, she had softened his missteps, clarifying what he misspoke, repairing relationships he strained, organizing tasks he ignored. When she withdrew that silent assistance, the household began to feel the gaps. Her absence in the background revealed how much of his authority depended on her steady correction. Decisions he once made with ease now unsettled him. Servants hesitated. Relatives questioned him gently, and routines faltered when he attempted to assert himself without her guidance. The household had grown accustomed to her precision, and without it, his actions appeared misaligned. He sensed the difference immediately, but did not know how to correct it. Each attempt to reclaim control only exposed the contrast between his uncertainty and her quiet mastery of the home. The wife did not challenge him. She simply allowed the natural order to reveal itself. When servants looked to her for clarification, she provided it calmly. When relatives sought direction, she answered with clear judgment. She did not highlight his weaknesses. She made her strength visible instead. People gravitated toward what steadied them, and he realized how far he had drifted from the center of the household's trust. There was no divorce, because the wife did not need one. Divorce would have been a public spectacle, a declaration of war she never intended to wage. She did not want to sever the structure, she wanted to reshape it. Separation would have granted him visibility, perhaps even sympathy. Remaining married exposed him instead. Every day he lived inside the home where her quiet competence surpassed his. And every day the household learned to rely less on him and more on her. He began to recognize his diminishing role through the smallest moments. A servant corrected his instruction because the wife had already set a different plan. A relative deferred to her opinion rather than his. Children approached her for guidance before they approached him. These gestures appeared polite, but their implications were unmistakable. Influence had migrated away from him, following the path of reliability. He felt this loss most acutely during gatherings, where he once stood confidently beside his wife. Now he lingered slightly behind her without noticing. People greeted her first. Their questions sought her perspective. Their expressions shifted toward her with ease. While his presence registered as an afterthought, he realized he had become a figure whose title carried more weight than his actions. The home respected the role he held, but no longer respected the authority he exercised. The mistress's departure had removed the most visible threat, but it also stripped away the distraction that once shielded him from self-awareness. With her gone, he faced the subtle consequences of months of instability. The wife never mentioned the past. She did not need to. The silence surrounding their history intensified his discomfort. He realized that while she had not retaliated, she had allowed the household to see him differently. His weakness grew not from humiliation, but from irrelevance. She managed the accounts with confidence. She organized seasonal duties flawlessly. She responded to crises with composure. He stepped aside because stepping forward risked exposing how unprepared he was. The household continued moving without pause, and he understood, quietly and painfully, that it would keep moving even without him. The wife did not gloat. She did not shift her demeanor. She had always been patient, steady, disciplined. These qualities, once overshadowed by his position, now defined the household. The more calmly she acted, the smaller his presence felt beside her. Her strength did not crush him, it eclipsed him. People did not view him as a defeated man, but as one whose importance had faded naturally. He recognized the truth too late. Power in a household did not vanish through force. It leaked away through neglect, distraction, and imbalance. Once gone, it settled into the hands of the person who had protected the structure without demanding acknowledgement. The wife became the quiet center of the home, and he remained orbiting the edges, aware of what he had lost but unable to reclaim it. His decline formed slowly, shaped not by confrontation but by her unbroken steadiness. What once defined him now slipped through his grasp, carried by the household toward the figure who held it upright. Further consequences gathered within the quiet, preparing to show what endured inside their altered union. Lessons drawn from a Tudor household rarely emerged through bold events. They appeared instead through the slow accumulation of quiet decisions, subtle gestures, and the steady reshaping of influence. The wife's two-step strategy, first weakening the mistress, then diminishing the husband, did not rely on confrontation. It relied on patience, observation, and restraint. What seemed passive from a distance revealed itself, over time, as a deliberate sequence of controlled choices. From this, several truths emerged, each rooted in the structure of the world she inhabited. Soft power endured, where force rarely did. The wife understood that a direct attack would have broken the fragile balance of the household. Loud accusations would have damaged her dignity, provoked unpredictable reactions, and given the mistress visibility she did not deserve. Instead, the wife allowed influence to shift naturally by strengthening her own position. She created reliability through consistency, earned respect through composure, and allowed people to come to her, not because she demanded authority, but because she embodied it. Power that grows quietly often lasts longer than power seized quickly. Silence proved more effective than words. In a home where every whisper could become rumor and every confrontation could ignite scandal, silence became a shield and a tool. The wife did not deny what happened. She simply did not give the household language to escalate it. Her calm absence of reaction forced others to observe rather than interpret. And observation revealed far more than explanation could. Her restraint made the mistress appear frantic. It made the husband appear unstable. It magnified every misstep they made while keeping her beyond reproach. People trusted what they could not criticize. They admired what did not bend, even under pressure. Her silence was not emptiness. It was direction. It guided opinion by leaving space for others to fill with their own conclusions. By choosing not to speak, she allowed perception to bend toward her naturally. Once shaped, those impressions held firm, reinforcing her position long after the conflict began. Legitimacy formed the deepest foundation of her strategy. She possessed what the mistress never could: social recognition, legal standing, and the weight of tradition behind her. She also possessed what the husband forfeited through his actions: moral credibility, even when she remained silent. Legitimacy spoke for her. It protected her reputation, fortified her alliances, and gave her stability while those around her wavered. She moved carefully within that framework, not exploiting it openly, but honoring it in ways that strengthened her influence. The mistress, lacking legitimacy, could not survive the shift in perception. No matter how compelling her presence once seemed, she had no structural support. When public sympathy moved toward the wife, the mistress stood alone. Her disappearance became inevitable, not because the wife expelled her, but because the system surrounding them rejected her presence the moment affection no longer shielded her. The husband, though still central in title, learned that authority without discipline and consistency dissolved silently. His decline did not come from his wife's interventions. It came from the absence of the support she once provided. When she stepped back, the gaps in his character became visible. His impulsiveness clashed with her discipline. His secrecy clashed with her clarity. His dependence on attention clashed with her reliance on structure. The two-step strategy revealed not only the mistress's fragility, but also his. What remained after these shifts was a home reorganized around the only stable force within it. The wife did not claim victory. She reclaimed equilibrium. The household followed her rhythm because it had already learned who kept it intact during a crisis. That understanding became the lasting lesson. Power did not need to announce itself to be real. And the strongest influence often came from the person who refused to be pulled into disorder. Observers learned from this as well. They saw how quiet gestures could realign an entire family. They recognized that influence flowed toward patience and away from impulsiveness. They understood that legitimacy created a foundation no mistress could occupy and no husband could undermine alone. Through silence and stability, the wife restored the balance of the household and secured a position that would outlast every emotional storm. By the time the strategy's full impact became clear, the household had transformed. The mistress was gone. The husband's authority had thinned. The wife's influence had become unmistakable. Her victory carried no announcement, no triumph, no spectacle. It lived in the restored order of the home and in the unspoken acknowledgement of those who depended on her. Her quiet method revealed truths that reshaped the home long after the conflict ended. What seemed passive proved deliberate. Guided by patience and legitimacy, deeper reflection settled along the fading tension, ready to expose how similar patterns unfolded across noble households of the era. In Tudor households across the realm, the pattern repeated itself with a slow familiarity that made it almost unremarkable to those who lived within its walls. Quiet adjustments, discreet shifts in daily routines, and the silent withdrawal of certain privileges formed a recognizable rhythm in marriages touched by an affair. Servants in these households had seen similar transitions before, and their recognition made the process steadier, as though each home operated by a shared set of unwritten rules. The wife in such circumstances observed how other noble women navigated similar situations, not to copy their actions, but to understand what held authority together when appearances were fragile. In many estates, noble families relied on the stability of marriage, not for emotional fulfillment, but for political continuity and financial clarity. The mistress, regardless of her charm or influence, rarely threatened the legal structure that defined inheritance and land rights. What she threatened instead was the public impression of order. Wives understood this distinction, and so their strategies were designed not to attack the woman directly, but to preserve the framework that legitimized their place. Observing similar households confirmed that preservation was always more effective than open confrontation, because it aligned with societal expectations and avoided unnecessary attention. Women across the upper ranks learned how to operate within these boundaries, shaping their responses according to the norms that protected their status. They did not challenge the law, they maneuvered beneath it. They did not reject the limits of custom. They used those limits to guide the household toward the result they needed. Watching others showed them that survival was not based on emotional resilience alone, but on an understanding of how reputation functioned in a world that valued silence more than confession. The ability to remain calm, to appear patient, and to maintain measured dignity was not simply moral discipline. It was a form of influence that could not be openly resisted. The legal wife in each household saw how the community responded to different approaches. Loud retaliation often backfired, drawing unwanted scrutiny and weakening the reputation she depended on. Quiet management, on the other hand, created no scandal. It left no clear moment for others to judge her. Instead, it allowed the household to shift gradually, without public debate or moral commentary. Other noble women had shown that a controlled response made the mistress appear impulsive, temporary, and exterior to the legitimate order of the home. Observing these outcomes gave wives not reassurance, but confirmation that silence was not passivity. It was a method. Patterns across noble families also revealed that men, even when confident in their discretion, were not immune to the consequences of shifting alliances within the home. Their mistresses, once protected by affection, became burdens when the household began to turn its attention back toward the legal structure of marriage. Servants in different estates displayed the same behavior, subtly favoring the wife's guidance, adjusting the flow of information, and framing conversations in ways that reaffirmed her role. Wives learned from witnessing this, understanding that the household did not depend solely on authority, but on collective perception. These observations shaped the way each woman carried herself. She learned to speak less in public, but to speak precisely when she did. She learned to hold her posture in crowded rooms, to maintain attentive stillness during family meals, and to avoid responding too quickly to news that involved her husband. This careful behavior echoed across noble households, creating a shared image of composed endurance. It made the wife not simply the central figure legally, but the stabilizing figure socially. Other women had shown that the community respected those who did not collapse under strain, and that respect could be more powerful than affection. Comparisons with other noble families also made clear that skill mattered more than emotional intensity. It was not the loudest complaint that shifted the flow of the household, but the smallest alteration in routine. It was not a dramatic declaration that changed loyalties, but the quiet consistency of a woman who refused to lose her composure. Wives saw that noble households across the region responded to predictability, and predictability came from calm governance rather than reactive emotion. These examples influenced how each wife navigated her own situation, showing her that success depended on subtlety rather than conflict. In the homes of wealthier families, where multiple servants worked in overlapping duties, The wife observed how influence could be spread through simple decisions about who entered which room, who delivered which messages, and who attended which private discussions. These small choices created boundaries around the mistress without explicitly naming them. Other women had done this before. They managed the household as though they were adjusting the flow of water through narrow channels. The consistency of these strategies across noble households proved that careful management was not only common, but expected among women of status. As she continued to observe, she recognized that husbands, regardless of their rank, often underestimated how deeply the household watched them. Silence allowed wives to redirect that awareness. Other noble families had demonstrated that men rarely noticed these shifts until the household's balance had already changed. Observing these patterns gave wives a sense of quiet confidence, not because the situation was easy, but because it followed a rhythm they understood. Her observations across noble households showed a method repeated in many forms. What seemed unique in her own home was part of a broader pattern shaped by tradition and quiet resilience. Comparison revealed not imitation, but a shared understanding of how order was preserved when a household risked falling out of alignment. There were no raised voices in the final days of this quiet struggle. The household moved through its routines with the same steady rhythm it had always known. Yet something in the air felt settled in a way that had not existed before. Her steps carried the same weight they had carried for years. But now the rooms acknowledged her presence differently. Doors opened a little sooner. Servants paused a little longer. Decisions flowed back toward her without anyone calling attention to the shift. The change was unannounced, but unmistakable. The mistress who once walked through these corridors with a sense of fragile elevation had already begun to fade from the household's memory. She had not been expelled, but her influence no longer reached the corners it once did. The man who brought her into the home with quiet confidence now sensed the unease that grew whenever her name was mentioned. The alliance he once believed was guided by affection no longer held its shape. It collapsed under the weight of silence, not accusation. He found himself standing alone with choices that once felt liberating, but now felt exposed. In the center of these tensions, the wife continued her work without altering her tone or behavior. She did not react to the shifting environment with triumph or resentment. Her movements remained steady, her posture unchanged. She handled the rituals of the household with the same calm as before. But the household responded to her differently now. What once felt like an obligation evolved into acknowledgement. Her presence regained the authority it had never legally lost, but had temporarily ceded to the distraction of another woman. The servants, who had watched every stage of this quiet conflict, adjusted themselves accordingly. Their eyes followed the same unspoken rules that governed Tudor homes for generations. They recognized where the structure had settled and aligned their loyalties without verbal instruction. Their glances, their pacing, the order in which they presented information, all of it returned to a pattern that placed the wife at the center of the household's functioning. This transition did not require approval or ceremony. It simply unfolded as the home sought stability. The husband, once confident in his ability to navigate both relationships, felt the shift most sharply. He did not lose his authority outright, but he no longer directed the emotional current of the house. His words carried weight, but not direction. He sensed how support that once seemed automatic now depended on the tone he used, the choices he made, and the behavior he displayed in public and private. The household watched him, not with admiration or hostility, but with an awareness that made him uneasy. He realized how much of his position had relied on stability, that the affair had slowly eroded. As the mistress receded into the background, the wife's influence expanded with a quiet certainty. She did not reclaim it through confrontation or declaration. She reclaimed it by standing still, while the rest of the house shifted around her. Her calm became the point of return for everyone who had felt unsettled by the disorder. She became the reference that gave the household its balance. The husband may have held the legal authority, but she held the structure that allowed the home to function. There were no victories spoken aloud. No one approached her to acknowledge what she had endured or what she had managed to preserve. Tudor households did not operate on gratitude. They operated on survival and alignment. Yet the outcome was clear to anyone who observed closely. She stood where she had always stood. But now the foundation beneath her was reinforced by experience and unspoken recognition. The mistress left the household quietly, carrying with her the knowledge that influence built on affection could not withstand the weight of structured authority. Her departure caused no disruption, no final confrontation, no dramatic unraveling. It was simply the end of a presence that had never been fully welcomed. The servants did not discuss it openly. The husband did not linger on the details. The wife did not allow the moment to alter her routine. The departure became another adjustment, absorbed into the quiet history of the home. In the days that followed, the wife walked through the rooms with a sense of clarity. She understood what had happened, not as triumph, but as confirmation of a truth shared among many women of her time. Influence did not require noise. Stability did not require force. And power, when used with patience and restraint, did not need acknowledgement to be real. She resumed the tasks she had always performed. But each gesture now felt anchored in something steadier than before. The household recognized her not only as the legal center of the home, but as the emotional anchor that preserved its integrity. The husband attempted to reassert himself in small ways. He tried to speak more firmly at the dinner table. He attempted to regain lightness in conversations with relatives. He carried himself as though nothing had shifted. Yet the household's response told him otherwise. People listened, but they did not follow with the same instinct. His comments were acknowledged, but not absorbed. The change was subtle, but clear. His authority still stood, but the center of gravity had moved. In the quiet of the evenings, the house settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and newly defined. The wife sat near the hearth, reviewing the tasks of the coming day with the same calm she had always shown. The servants moved around her with steady competence. The husband watched from a distance, aware that something in the balance of the home had shifted beyond his control. He was not defeated, but he was no longer unchallenged. His influence now depended on the structure she quietly upheld. This was not a victory that demanded celebration. It was not a triumph that required applause. It was the restoration of order after a period of instability. It was the reaffirmation of a role that had never disappeared, only dimmed. And it was the quiet recognition that in Tudor households, survival depended less on voice and more on presence. There was no open battle that defined the end of this conflict. No announcement marked who had prevailed. There was only a woman who continued to stand when everything else had settled into silence. Tonight, may your thoughts settle as quietly as this fading storm. May the calm of the closing day rest gently around you, and may sleep come to you with the same steady certainty that returned to this Tudor home. Good night.